The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall live in the house of the Lord forever. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Well, after having been gone for so long and worshiping at home, it's hard to describe how nice it is to see you guys out there. So good morning. It's good to see you. My 3-year-old tells me that we do not use the word hate. Isn't that right, Pearl? Yeah. Instead, she says, I very don't like this, or I very don't like that. So I'm here standing before you today to confess that I very do not like the month of August. In Texas, August is Valley of the Shadow of Death. August is like an oven that someone forgot to turn off, and it just keeps getting hotter. In August, the ground never cools off, and in the cool of the morning, you can reach down and feel the heat from the day before. The sun rises, and the pavement sears our souls, and the dying grass feels like pins and needles beneath our feet. In August, we're better off staying inside. August means the end of summer as we know it. August means relaxing and vacations, that's all over and done with. For students and educators, August means that it's time to go back to school, and that's an awful thought. For baseball fans like me, August means that the All-Star break has long come and gone. August is where the Texas Rangers season goes to die. August also feels like a spiritual valley. Falling halfway between Easter and Christmas, August feels like the bottom of the Christian calendar. August is stranded between the victory of Easter and the advent of Christmas. In many ways, the church age feels like one long August stretched between Christ's first coming and his second. And meanwhile, death's curse hangs over our head like a hot August sun. So when August comes around, I'm reminded of the valley of the shadow of death, which in turn reminds me of Psalm 23. Now, you know it well. There, King David describes himself as a sheep that's well cared for. He is led to green pastures, and there he lacks nothing. Having so often lost the way of righteousness, he is thankful and glad to be on the right path. David knows what it's like to be exhausted, to run for his life, to run from his own flesh and blood. But he also remembers God leading him beside still waters and restoring his soul. He knows what it's like to be surrounded by death, but he fears no evil because his shepherd is with him. David feasts in abundance, and his enemy does not consume him. And goodness and mercy pursue him all of his days. But reading about David's comfort only comforts us, but so much. His comfort is his own, and we have our own woes to tend to. So we pick up Psalm 23 and we read it in our time of loss, and we claim David's blessings for our very own. We turn to the psalm with heavy hearts, and we try to become the sheep in his green pastures. We gaze after still waters. We see ourselves pursuing paths of righteousness for his name's sake. We find ourselves in the dark valley of the shadow, and we try our best not to fear, for God is with us. We try to feel the comfort of his rod and staff, and we hope that he's preparing a table for us in the midst of our enemies. We long for the day that our cups will overflow with joy. And by the psalm's end, we look forward to dwelling in his house forever. This is how we read the psalm in our moment of need, full of hope and peace that passes all understanding. The problem is that we look around the valley and we struggle to find the peace and comfort that the psalm speaks of. In the shadow, death continues to oppress life like an August afternoon. In the valley of death, abortion is treated like a common mercy. Those who are born grow up to live in an age of pandemic and political unrest. And in our day, people find themselves happier making enemies than they do making friends. And the friends and family we love most are taken from us in their time of need, long before their time is due. It's easy to tell ourselves that things aren't that bad, and we can tell ourselves that everything is fine until we truly behold the suffering of another, until we truly taste the bitterness of sin and death for ourselves. Our world is loud with pain and fear, and in the quiet of our own hearts, we wonder if God really knows how hard it is down here. Does he know what it feels like to lose a loved one? Does he know what it feels like to leave a loved one behind? God may be our shepherd, but we wonder if he knows what it's like to be a sheep in the valley. But then we remember that he does. He knows exactly what it's like to be a lamb in low places. In fact, Jesus' life looks exactly like that of the sheep in Psalm 23. The psalm begins with, "The Lord is my shepherd," and we remember that the Father was Jesus' shepherd all of his days and that he knew no want. Jesus longed to see his Father's will carried out on earth as it is in heaven. His heart's desire was to see all things reconciled to his Father, and it was the Father's good will to give the Son exactly what he sought most. The Father loved the Son, and he gave all things into his hands. Then the psalm speaks of sheep resting in green pastures, and we remember that the Father laid his Son down in the green pastures of his people, the children of Israel. Jesus was sent to live among God's people, and God's people raised him in the ways of his Father. It was no accident that he was given to believing parents, that he might be nourished on the very word that spoke of him. Then the shepherd leads his sheep beside still waters, and we remember that the Lord led Jesus by the still waters of the Jordan. We remember how he restored his soul with baptism and prepared him to meet Satan in the wilderness. We remember how the Father revealed his love for his Son Jesus from on high, saying, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. This is the one with whom my spirit rests." And how wonderful would it have been to see this? How wonderful would it have been to see how wonderful this made Jesus feel? To know that he's making his Father happy and to show the world that his Father loves him. Then the psalm speaks of righteousness for his name's sake. And we recall that the Father led Jesus in paths of righteousness all of his days. Every day the Son loved the Father perfectly and pursued his law with his whole heart. Here Jesus succeeded where Adam failed. Here Jesus succeeds where we fail. Jesus followed after the Father and his word, even as a sheep follows his shepherd's voice. But then he finds himself in a deep, dark valley. And when we hear those words, the valley of the shadow of death, we think of a lowly place where there is no breeze and there is no light, and where violence is always heard in the distance. We think of the cross, where darkness fell over the land and the light of the sun failed. But the valley of the shadow of death speaks of more than Jesus' death. The valley of the shadow of death speaks of the world that we all find ourselves in. In the book of Job, the phrase is used to describe a land of darkness and deep shadow, a land of gloom like thick darkness, like deep shadow without any order, where light is as thick as dark. Job was describing Sheol, the land of the dead, an unending valley of shadow. There the dead find themselves far removed from the light and hope of this life, And in this sense, the valley of the shadow of death speaks of the realm of the dead beyond this world. But in the New Testament, it takes on a whole new meaning. In Matthew, we see the same phrase used to describe the people Jesus came to minister to. There it says, "The people dwelling in great darkness have seen a great light, and for those dwelling in the region of the shadow of death, on them a light has dawned." To these Jesus came to preach, telling them to repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. In Matthew, the shadow of death is used to describe the land of the living, especially the land of those living in the darkness of sin. In Job, the valley of the shadow of death refers to the realm of the dead, but in the New Testament, we see that the valley of the shadow actually rests upon the world of the living like a curse. And it's this curse that Jesus comes to undo by chasing it away with the light of his face. Throughout his ministry, Jesus traversed the valley of the shadow of death, and he healed the sick, and he made the lame to walk, and the blind to see, and the dead to rise. And he condemned the religion of his day, calling it a dead faith, a whitewashed tomb. And all the while, he feared no evil, because his Father was with him. The shepherd's rod and staff comforted him, both with discipline and guidance. Now, it's strange to think that Jesus was comforted by the shepherd's discipline, but this is exactly what we hear in Isaiah when God speaks to his servant and says, "I am the Lord, I have called you in righteousness, I will take you by the hand, and I will keep you, and I will give you as a covenant for the people, a light for the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, and to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison, those who sit in darkness. The Father will take him by the hand, and he will keep him, even as a covenant for his people." Jesus would later pray with fear and trembling in the garden, but he would find comfort and trust in his Father's will, the promise that he would be given for the nations, for his people, to set the captives free, to reconcile his fellow man with his Father. The Father comforts the Son by giving him as a covenant for his people, even for his enemies, even for those that walk in the valley of the shadow, is he given. And in this way, Jesus makes friends of his enemies. This is why Psalm 23 shifts from a valley of death to a table of life, saying, "You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies." The Father prepares a kingly table for his Son, a table where his enemies are invited to eat and drink and to become his friends. Here at the table, the king is praised and anointed, and his cup overflows with joy, and goodness and mercy pursue him all of his days. So in times of trouble, we turn to Psalm 23 for comfort. But if we look closely, we find Jesus' life in every verse. And we begin to realize that the comforts in Psalm 23 are his, and that it's in him that we find these comforts. It's in him that we share life with a covenant people. It's in him that we share the blessings of a covenant-keeping God. It's in him we share the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's table. It's in him that we share righteousness through faith. It's in him we share the comfort of his rod and his staff, and it's in him that we share life everlasting. Each of these blessings comfort us in a unique way, but it's the table of life that comforts Christ and his people in their most desperate time of need. It's the table that comforts in the valley of the shadow. It's the table that brings us out of the valley of the shadow and into the goodness and mercy of God. But the table is a last meal, and last meals are dark and awful to think of. They're dark and awful things to watch. How can the last meal comfort anyone? It's hard to believe that Jesus was comforted at the Last Supper. The meal was full of bitter herbs and bitter truths, and he was no doubt anxious about what was to happen. And yet, he says, "I earnestly desire to eat this meal with you." It wasn't the meal alone that he desired, and it wasn't the meal alone that would comfort him. It was the faces of those that he loved, the ones that he would be given for as a covenant. He longed to see his friends' faces at his table, the captives that he would set free. And the disciples were glad to share their meal with him. They were glad to eat and drink with their friend. They were glad to see his face. They were glad to be served by the one they loved most. And the same is true of us at this table. We approach this table and we look with eyes of faith and we see him there and we are glad for it. We love being served by Christ and we love being nourished with Christ, not in our bodies, but in our souls. At the table, we are nourished and comforted by the presence of the one we love most. And our cup overflows with joy and comfort. And there we approach the table and we see what Christ saw, that we are not alone. We see that we are not alone at this table. The shadow of death is a dark and lonesome and isolating place. But at his table, we are never alone. At his table, we see fellow believers approaching one by one to eat and drink at our side. At the table, we're reminded that we are not alone in this world, and in the darkest moments of life, Christ is never far off because he is in each and every one of us, and we are his presence to one another. He is ever present in a time of trouble, in a quick text, or in a long phone call, or in a cup of coffee, or in a much-needed meal, or in a late-night prayer. Time and time again, you have comforted Amber and I in our moment of need. And you've shown us that what we see at this table is true, that we're not alone, and that he's with us always. This valley can be a lonely place, but take comfort, for those who eat and drink at this table are never alone. The table also comforts us by reminding us that Christ's love is stronger than death. Now, we who live in the valley find this hard to believe, that the power of love is stronger than death. Not politics, not economics, not violence, not a bomb blast, but love. I doubt that. But even as I doubt that, he calls me back to his table. We seek solutions for the world's problems, but his solution is to prepare a table, to put on an extravagant feast for our souls, and to spare no expense for the one that he loves most, to spare no expense for you. In a valley that searches endlessly for the next cause, the next candidate, the next trend, we can rest assured that Christ's love is all the solution that this world needs. And this should come as a comforting thought, to know that Christ's love is enough for this place. Best of all, the table reminds us that this isn't all there is, that there's something more, that there's something greater beyond the walls of our valley. As sure as Jesus calls us to celebrate his death until he comes again, we're reminded that we won't live and die here forever. The time is coming when he will return and raise the valley into a mountain peak and chase the shadow away with the light of his face, and death will be no more. At his table, we hope and taste and see that his promise is not in vain. At his table, we eat his bread and drink his wine, and we taste the truth of his word, and his spirit wells up within us, and we feel his love. You come to this table, and you eat and drink, and you know that goodness and mercy will follow you all of your days, and that someday death will be a distant memory, a bad dream. Eat and drink and feel the day coming when you will rise again and dwell in the house of the Lord forever.